Tonight, we begin with something deeply relatable. Sleep, or, more precisely, how people in the Middle Ages slept, which turns out to be far stranger than most of us could imagine. Before you settle in, consider liking the video and subscribing, but only if you genuinely enjoy what you see here. And feel free to share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the globe. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, soothing hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Long before electricity, TikTok, and modern sleep hygiene influencers, medieval people followed a nighttime routine that would utterly baffle today's melatonin-dependent crowd. It was known as segmented sleep, a natural, two-part sleep cycle neatly divided like a dry medieval biscuit. The pattern was straightforward. After sunset, most people went to bed early, drifting into what they called first sleep. Roughly 4 hours later, they'd wake up not from restlessness or anxiety, but as part of a deliberate, expected pause. This middle period, often called the watch, lasted 1 to 2 hours and was filled with what can only be described as medieval midnight multitasking. This wasn't insomnia, it was simply how sleep worked. The hours between the two sleeps were seen as practical, useful, and sometimes surprisingly social. People used this time to pray, read religious texts, tend to the fire, or check on their livestock, because nothing disrupts your peace like wondering whether your goat wandered off in the night. And yes, this interval was also considered the ideal time for intimacy. Medieval physicians and marriage manuals noted that the body was well rested and the mind calm during this phase, a polite way of saying you were too tired to argue. So if you ever thought waking up early to brew coffee for your partner was romantic, know that your ancestors were setting the bar in an entirely different direction. After this interlude came second sleep, which carried people through until sunrise. Everyone participated in this rhythm: monks, farmers, even literary figures like Chaucer, who casually referenced it in his writings. That means even medieval literature included stories about people not sleeping through the night. Interestingly, modern science has suggested that segmented sleep might actually be more aligned with human biology. Without artificial light, our natural circadian rhythms tend to follow this biphasic pattern. So the next time you find yourself wide awake at 2 a.m., don't panic. Just whisper, "Ah yes, the watch has begun," and go tend your symbolic fireplace. It wasn't until the industrial era, with its factories, gas lamps, and growing anxiety about unproductivity, that society began enforcing the idea of 8 uninterrupted hours of sleep, as if rest were a competitive sport timed to the minute. In the medieval world, waking in the middle of the night wasn't a failure, it was the schedule. And everyone was on it, whether they liked it or not. Let's talk about beds, or rather, the medieval version of them. Today, we obsess over thread counts, memory foam, cooling gels, and whether a mattress feels like a cloud. In medieval Europe, a bed was often just a pile of organic material that used to be alive, now flattened under the weight of restless nights and unspoken regrets for peasants. The typical bed was a straw mattress called a pallet, made by stuffing straw or hay into a rough fabric sack, if they were lucky enough to own one. Otherwise, it was just straw strewn across the floor, possibly damp, possibly already claimed by a cat. These pallets weren't comfortable, but they beat the alternative: nothing at all. Straw was cheap, plentiful, and offered some insulation against the cold. Unfortunately, it was also a haven for insects, lice, and the occasional field mouse, making sleep an exercise in cautious stillness. If it itched, you ignored it. If it bit, you shifted slightly and hoped for the best. Families with a bit more means might elevate the straw mattress onto a wooden frame. This didn't dramatically improve comfort, but it did slightly reduce the chance of waking up with beetles in your ear. Linens were a luxury. Most people slept in the clothes they'd worn all day. Pajamas weren't really a thing, nor was personal space. Entire families, parents, children, maybe a grandparent, all shared the same sleeping area, sometimes even the same straw pile. If you got too warm, you could always roll into your cousin's elbow. Nobles, of course, enjoyed proper beds, large wooden frames, feather mattresses, embroidered sheets, and canopies to block drafts and, hopefully, lice. These beds were so valuable they were bequeathed in wills. You didn't inherit land, you inherited Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy feather bed. Still, for most medieval people, a bed wasn't a sanctuary of comfort. It was a place to avoid freezing, to stay clear of the chickens, and maybe, just maybe, to dream of one day sleeping on something that didn't squawk or rustle. When we hear nightcap today, we think of a cozy drink, perhaps whiskey by a warm fire, paired with a questionable life choice. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap wasn't a beverage. It was a hat-reel, tangible, and often comically pointed, designed to keep your head from freezing off while you slept. Medieval architecture wasn't known for insulation. Stone walls, drafty thatched roofs, and windows made of thin animal horn or oiled parchment did little against the cold. Central heating, that was called the dog. So to retain body heat, especially since it escapes fastest through the scalp, people wore nightcaps. These came in many shapes, but the most iconic was long and pointed, like something a wizard who moonlights as a chimney sweep might wear. Made from wool, linen, or whatever scrap fabric could be spared without upsetting the family goat, they served a clear purpose. For men, it was practical. For women, it often doubled as a coif or head repulso, preserving modesty and covering hair that hadn't seen soap since last Lent. Beyond warmth, nightcaps carried social weight. In some regions, married women were expected to cover their heads at all times, even in bed. The cap itself could be dyed or embroidered to reflect family status. Nothing says I've made it like going to sleep with a miniature flag on your skull in urban settings. The nightcap even signaled being off-duty. If you opened your door wearing one, it was a polite medieval way of saying, "I'm not dressed for conversation." Translation: please go away. Nightcaps were often paired with nightshirts, long, loose tunics akin to what Ebenezer Scrooge might wear, minus the ghostly moral lessons. Sleepwear wasn't sexy, it was practical, itchy, and occasionally flammable. Today, sleeping next to a stranger is usually limited to red-eye flights, extreme camping, or an Airbnb mishap. But in medieval Europe, it was not only normal, it was unavoidable. Imagine you're a traveling merchant, a pilgrim, or someone whose mule gave out halfway to Norwich. You find an rare luxury and ask for a place to sleep. What you get isn't a private room or even a clean floor. You get a spot in a bed that's already occupied. Medieval inns operated more like human bunkhouses than modern hotels. Privacy wasn't expected. If there was space in a bed, you shared it usually with complete strangers who might snore, mutter in their sleep, or sport a suspicious number of boils. This wasn't rude, it was efficient. Beds could hold 2, 3, or even 4 travelers, depending on size and social tolerance. In cities, you might end up in a dormitory-like hall with rows of beds and zero personal space. Snoring contests went unjudged. Elbow territory was fiercely defended. Some inns tried to group guests by profession: blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, thieves with allegedly other thieves, but often it was first come, first sprawled. To modern germaphobes, this sounds like a nightmare, but back then, it was an upgrade from sleeping outdoors with wolves, rain, and the occasional peasant uprising. Worried about theft, many travelers tied their purses to their belts or hid them under their clothes. Others slept atop their bundles, turning luggage into both pillow and alarm system. If someone moved your bag, it usually meant you were about to wake up poorer. The wealthy, of course, avoided this fate. Nobles traveled with entourages and camped in relative comfort or simply demanded their own rooms, assuming the innkeeper valued their roof. In the medieval world, going to bed wasn't just about pulling up a blanket. It was a spiritual operation, a nightly gamble where your eternal soul was on the line. People didn't just sleep. They prepared to potentially die. Hence the popularity of bedtime prayers. Forget lavender spray or calming podcasts. Medieval sleepers wound down with confessions, psalms, and spiritual clauses, just in case they passed between good night and dawn. The logic was simple. You could die at any moment from illness, fire, demons, or simply being over 30 in the year 1247. So you'd better say your prayers not for comfort, but because hell was terrifying, and you didn't want to arrive uninvited, unwashed, and spiritually disheveled. Take the classic childhood prayer. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. It sounds sweet until you realize it's essentially a legal document, written by a 7-year-old acknowledging death as a likely bedtime outcome. Adults often kept a catalog of prayers for different threats. One for guilt, one for demons lurking in the rafters, one for plague prevention, which, unfortunately, aged poorly. Some even prayed to specific saints known for watching over sleepers, holy bouncers guarding your soul at the club door, the devout monks, nuns, anxious nobles, the final prayer service before bed. After Compline, they observed a vow of silence, which wasn't hard given how exhausted, underfed, and mildly terrified of the dark everyone was. Children were also taught to pray not just for their souls, but to keep them occupied instead of asking why the dog was in their bed again. Parents reminded them that angels were watching, which sounds sweet until you realize it was less guardian angel and more celestial surveillance system. In short, bedtime prayer was less about peace and more about last-minute spiritual damage control, like medieval antivirus software. You hoped it worked, even if you didn't fully understand how. In the modern world, dreams are often dismissed as nonsense stress, too much cheese, or your brain filing paperwork in the dark. But in the Middle Ages, dreams were taken with deadly seriousness. They weren't just random thoughts. They were messages from God, saints, the devil, your guardian angel, or that weird relic you kissed last Sunday. Some dreams were divine revelations. Others were demonic traps. Either way, you were expected to pay attention, possibly write it down, confess it, or fast for 3 days just to be safe. Theologians, monks, and self-proclaimed visionaries spent enormous energy interpreting dreams. Entire books were dedicated to decoding them. Dream of fire might be hell. Dream of water could mean purification or drowning. Dream of a man with a goat's head juggling fish? Call a priest immediately and maybe relocate. Medieval people believed your soul remained active during sleep, so your dream actions could reveal hidden sins or spiritual weaknesses. That mildly embarrassing dream about stealing bread might be your subconscious confessing real-world gluttony or just hunger. Either way, better to confess it, just in case. Monks and nuns often recorded dreams and shared them with spiritual superiors. Some were celebrated for holy visions. Others were gently advised to eat fewer onions before bed. Dreams also served as plot devices. Medieval literature is filled with dream sequences where knights meet angels, demons, or poetic creatures spouting allegories about virtue. Dreams were the Netflix of the medieval world, except with more symbolism and fewer happy endings. The church remained suspicious. Not all dreams were divine. Some were believed to be planted by demons to corrupt the innocent. An unwholesome dream might mean your soul was under attack or you just slept too close to fireplace fumes. Now, many modern pet owners let their animals sleep in bed, a cozy, if occasionally smelly, arrangement. But in the Middle Ages, sharing a bed with an animal wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was a survival strategy. Medieval homes weren't built for comfort. Stone walls, no insulation, and drafts so aggressive they probably had names. Central heating. That was called the family pig. In peasant households, humans and livestock often shared the same room and, sometimes, the same bed or straw pile. Chickens wandered freely. Dogs curled at your feet. Pigs snorted by the hearth. If you were lucky, none bit you during the night. This wasn't about affection, it was about warmth. Animals generated body heat. A large dog could keep your toes from freezing. A cow in the corner might raise the room temperature by a degree or two, which in January felt like a miracle. Most peasant homes had just one room for cooking, eating, sleeping, and occasionally dying. Everyone, humans and animals alike, made do in shared space. Children might be nestled between parents and a goat. A chicken might serve as an alarm clock. As for hygiene, best not to ask too many questions. Wealthier families rarely slept with livestock, though lapdogs in bed were common, not for warmth, but for fashion and flea redistribution. Some castles even had dedicated sleeping quarters for favorite animals. Because nothing says power like a dog with its own room and title. There were drawbacks, of course. Animals are loud, restless, and famously indifferent to personal space. But medieval people adapted. A hoof in the face at 3 a.m., just part of the routine. If you've ever shared a hostile room and thought, this is a bit much, consider the medieval monastic dormitory, a place where comfort went to die under a vow of silence. Monasteries had no use for personal space, softness, or fun. The typical dormitory housed dozens of monks in a single large room, arranged like morally upright sardines. Beds, if you could call them, that were wooden planks, sometimes with a straw mattress if the abbot was feeling generous, or it was a feast day. Monks slept, fully clothed, not for modesty, but because getting dressed in the dark at 2 a.m. for prayers was more painful than just staying dressed. Their robes, belts, and sandals doubled as spiritual armor and poor insulation. If you got cold, you layered up. If you got hot, well, you didn't. There were no pillows, no privacy curtains, and absolutely no talking. Silence was enforced, not suggested, under the rule of Saint Benedict. Roll over and groan too loudly, and you might be on chamberpot duty for a week. Snoring was a gray area. You couldn't control it. But if it disturbed others, your cellmates, or the Lord, might hold it against you. Lighting was minimal, maybe one candle. You didn't need to see. You just needed to lie still and not sin. That was the goal, despite the austerity. Monks believed their Spartan beds prepared the soul for the afterlife, denying the flesh any excess. Sleep wasn't pleasure. It was a monitored necessity. Some even slept sitting up to avoid luxury, dreams, or circulation. Compared to this, a peasant's straw pile with snoring pigs almost seems luxurious. At least the pig didn't judge you. Now, consider something that would horrify most modern sleepers: waking up voluntarily at 2 a.m. not for the bathroom, but for loud, cold, candlelit prayer. In medieval monasteries, this was standard. Monks and nuns followed a rigid schedule based on the canonical hours, including matins, the first service of the day, which actually occurred in the deepest part of the night. When even owls hesitated to wake, a bell would toll, a fane rung by the unlucky soul who drew the short straw. The entire dormitory of robed, sleep-deprived figures would shuffle silently to the chapel. Still, fully dressed monks didn't do pajamas. Their only layering system was spiritual. Inside the chapel, by flickering candlelight and echoing stone vaults, they chanted psalms and recited scriptures while trying desperately not to fall asleep on their feet. There are records of monks being punished for dozing mid-prayer, usually with extra chores or more prayers. Fall asleep during matins. Congratulations, you now lead the next one. Matins could last an hour or more. Some enthusiastic orders stretched it to 2. Imagine staying spiritually engaged while your stomach reminds you dinner was lentils and a moral lesson, and your body is shutting down afterward. Monks either returned to bed for second sleep or, in stricter orders, moved straight into study or manual labor, because nothing says holy discipline like threshing wheat on 4 hours of fragmented rest. Why so early? The idea was to sacrifice comfort and dedicate the quietest, darkest hours to God, uninterrupted by daylight, warmth, or REM cycles. It was a powerful symbol of devotion once you got past the numb feet, candle smoke, and Brother Ambrose's off-key chanting. In today's world, sleeping alone is often seen as a luxury, a sign of independence or peace. In the Middle Ages, it was suspicious, impractical, or downright unsafe. Start with warmth. Beds weren't cozy. Stone walls and open chimneys didn't trap heat, and central heating was centuries away. So people shared beds, not for intimacy, but for basic thermal survival. Children slept with siblings, parents, and sometimes visiting neighbors' kids. It was like a compulsory sleepover, but beyond warmth, there was a spiritual reason. Many believed the night was when the devil worked overtime. Alone in the dark, your soul was vulnerable to temptation or worse, possession. Having others nearby created a moral buffer zone. If something went wrong, at least someone would witness it or catch the demon first. Solitary sleep was unthinkable, not just for comfort, but because ghosts, fairies, and wandering spirits populated the nightly landscape. Tales warned that sleeping alone opened the door to mischief and spiritual peril. Unlike modern bedtime stories, these didn't end in hugs, they ended in disappearances. Even married couples often shared beds with children, servants, or random guests. Privacy wasn't a concept, it was a modern myth. The idea of two people alone in a large bed would have seemed wasteful, deeply suspicious. In religious life, monks slept communally. Being assigned to sleep alone was often punishment. Solitary sleep meant opportunity for sin. Group sleep meant public accountability. So, next time you're curled up alone in a clean, quiet room, enjoy it. In medieval times, you'd likely have 2 kids, a sheepdog, and a cousin snoring beside you. If you've ever dozed off sitting up in a lecture, carriage, or waiting room, you probably woke with a crick in your neck and regret. But in the Middle Ages, sleeping upright wasn't an accident. It was a lifestyle. The wealthy and devout sometimes chose to sleep propped up rather than lying flat for several reasons, none particularly restful. First, medical theory held that lying flat harmed digestion, lungs, or the balance of bodily humors. In a world where a sneeze might rearrange your soul, this made perfect sense. Upright sleeping was believed to prevent congestion of the brain, a dramatic way of saying don't drown in your own phlegm. Second, there were spiritual concerns. Lying flat resembled the posture of the dead. You didn't want to confuse God or attract the angel of death by sleeping like you were in a coffin as a result. Many slept semi-reclined, supported by bolsters, pillows, or angled bed frames, perfect for digesting a meat pie or fending off surprise demons. Monks took it further. In stricter orders, they slept sitting upright on benches or leaning against cold walls, who'd pulled tight. It wasn't about health, it was discipline. Comfort led to dreams. Dreams led to sin. Sin led to 5 a.m. confession. This wasn't about rest. It was about virtue, discomfort, and peculiar theology. Now, forget goblins under the bed. For medieval people, the real nighttime monsters were already in the sheets, small, persistent, and utterly indifferent to your prayers. Fleas, lice, and the unofficial mascot of medieval bedrooms, the bedbug. Let's be honest. Hygiene wasn't medieval Europe's strong suit. Baths were rare, laundry expensive, and soap sometimes made from questionable ingredients. Add straw mattresses, shared bedding, and live chickens underfoot, and you've got a pest paradise. Fleas and lice were so common they were practically family. Peasants lived with them daily. Nobles weren't immune in satin sheets, they suffered. Some wealthy households employed nitpickers, servants tasked with removing lice from hair and clothing. Imagine Master of the Royal Scalp as your job title. Bedbugs were silent assassins, hiding in wood cracks and mattress seams, emerging at night to feast like tiny vampires. Nightcaps and full sleepwear weren't always about warmth. They were pest armor. Solutions ranged from mildly effective to wildly bizarre. Burning wormwood or tansy, sleeping with garlic onions, or ashes in the bed, methods that repelled bugs but also romance. Fleas were even seen as symbols of sin-biting, reminders of humanity's fall and poor bedding choices. Poems were written about them, some moralizing, some weirdly romantic. Let us be united like the flea that bites us both. While modern sleep is disrupted by phones and streetlights, medieval sleep was interrupted by scratching, twitching, and the unsettling feeling that something was crawling on your shin, because it was. We've all had restless nights, but have you ever tried sleeping in 100 pounds of iron? In the Middle Ages, some people did, because nothing says sweet dreams like being ready to joust in your sleep. To be clear, most people even knights didn't sleep in full armor regularly. It was hot, heavy, and loud. Rolling over in chainmail is like napping inside a bag of cutlery. But during war or in hostile lands, sleeping partially armored was the safer choice. Comfort was optional. Survival was essential. A knight on campaign might remove only his helmet and gauntlets, keeping his mail shirt or breastplate on in case of a midnight raid. Waking to the sound of hooves was easier when you were already half-suited in besieged castles. Men-at-arms slept with swords or axes at their sides, aggressive security blankets. Shields doubled as pillows. If enemies breached the walls, at least you wouldn't need to dress. Sleeping in armor wasn't restful. Iron doesn't breathe, and chainmail pinches. Add cold stone floors, minimal bedding, and the symphony of snoring comrades and crackling torches, and you've got a sleep environment worse than an airport terminal. Even non-combatants in dangerous regions might nap in gambeson quilted jackets, offering light protection and slightly more padding than prayer alone. And if you rolled over the wrong way, you'd clank so loudly everyone assumed the apocalypse had returned. In a time when nightly demons, lice, and pigs in bed were normal, you might think sleepwalking was just another inconvenience. But no, it was far more dramatic. In the Middle Ages, if someone wandered in their sleep, people didn't blame stress or fatigue. They assumed possession, witchcraft, or unfinished business with the Holy Roman Empire. Sleepwalking, or noctambulation, if you wanted to impress the local monk, was poorly understood and deeply feared. Watching someone rise from their pallet, shuffle across the room, and stare blankly at a wall wasn't a harmless quirk. It was the devil's rehearsal dinner. Accounts suggest people were genuinely spooked. Picture a man in a nightshirt, candle in hand, eyes glazed, muttering Latin he didn't know while stepping over livestock. You'd assume ghost or heretic. Depending on your priest, an exorcism might be scheduled before breakfast. Some blamed bad humors, especially excess black bile, the medieval catch-all, for the unexplainable. Others believed the soul briefly left the body during sleep, leaving it free to wander like an unattended mule. To prevent these nighttime escapades, people tried herbal remedies, bedtime prayers, iron charms, or in rural areas, simply tying the sleepwalker's leg to a chair. Extreme. Maybe, but medieval homes had open hearths, knives everywhere, and chamber pots ripe for tragic spills. There were even rumors of people climbing onto rooftops in their sleep. Whether true or exaggerated, The fear of leaping dreamers led to barred windows and theological debates. Could you sin while unconscious? Thankfully, most sleepwalkers just paced, muttered, or tried to open imaginary doors. But if someone wandered into a church while asleep, locals might treat it as a divine sign or call for a cleansing ritual, just to be safe. And it wasn't just bells. Storms arrived often and without warning. Without weather forecasts or insulated windows, every thunderclap felt apocalyptic. Roofs leaked, shutters rattled, and chimneys wailed like bad. Still, people slept because they had no choice. Work didn't pause for insomnia. Plowing didn't wait. Praying didn't stop. Running from raiders certainly didn't. Even large-scale disasters rarely canceled bedtime. In the 14th century, people somehow slept through famine, war, and the Black Death itself. When death carts rolled through town at dawn, it was treated less as a crisis and more as a grim alarm clock. And if you didn't wake up, some believed that was an act of mercy. There are records of villagers sleeping through earthquakes, barn fires, and angry mobs. Chronic sleep deprivation was the norm, and the body adapted. If you labored from sunrise to sunset, ate barely enough to survive, and spent your days evading mud, taxes, and spiritual condemnation, you collapsed into sleep with force. Then there were those who used sleep as an escape hatch, faced with illness, grief, or the very real belief that the world might end. Event forecast roughly once per century. Some simply pulled a cloak over their heads, whispered a prayer, and drifted off. There's a quiet wisdom in that surrender. In the winter of 1692, the village of Salem, Massachusetts, was wrapped in more than snow. It was cloaked in tension, suspicion, and a slow-burning fear that seeped into timber-framed homes and frozen fields alike. The people of Salem were Puritans, devout, disciplined, and deeply superstitious. They believed they were building a holy community in the wilderness, a city on a hill, watched by God and hunted by Satan. Life was already harsh. The village had recently fractured from Salem town over religious and political disputes. Crops had failed. Smallpox had decimated nearby settlements. Wars with indigenous tribes had left behind trauma and grief. Neighborly friction simmered over land, inheritance, and who belonged, and who didn't. Add to this the long, dark, bitter New England winter, and something was bound to snap. That breaking point arrived in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, the village minister. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began behaving strangely. They screamed without cause, threw objects, and twisted their bodies into unnatural shapes. At times, they fell into trance silent, eyes wide with terror. Neighbors whispered of curses. The girls claimed invisible forces pinched and bit them. Reverend Parris, uncertain how to respond, summoned a local physician, William Griggs. When no physical ailment could be found, Griggs delivered a diagnosis that would ignite a firestorm: witchcraft. That single word lit the kindling of fear, already smoldering in Salem, in a community where witches were believed to be real agents of the devil. Dangerous and deceptive, the idea wasn't far-fetched. And if the devil could infiltrate the minister's own home, what hope did anyone else have? Under pressure from adults and peers, the girls began naming names. At first, they targeted women, on society's margins, outsiders, misfits, the socially inconvenient. But soon, accusations reached the respectable, the wealthy, even the devout. Salem was small, but what unfolded would echo far beyond its borders. What began as whispers in the dark would soon become cries from the gallows, a legacy of paranoia that still stains American history. Once witchcraft took root in Salem, it spread like ivy, quiet at first, then suffocating everything it touched. The afflicted girls, Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and soon others, like Ann Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis, grew bolder with each passing day. They convulsed in court, screamed during prayers, and swore they saw dark spirits hovering over certain villagers. This wasn't childhood fancy. It was theatrical, public, and terrifyingly believed. The first accused were those with the least protection. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, was known for muttering when turned away from doorsteps. Villagers claimed her words were curses. She smoked a pipe, snapped at children, and refused to conform, making her, in their eyes, the perfect witch. Sarah Osborne hadn't attended church in over a year and had scandalized the town by marrying her indentured servant after her husband's death. A woman who defied norms was, by definition, suspect. Then there was Tituba, the enslaved woman in Reverend Paris's household. Originally from Barbados, her accent, folktales, and spiritual practices unnerved the villagers. Under intense pressure, possibly physical abuse, Tituba confessed to witchcraft. But instead of calming fears, her confession unleashed them. She described a tall man in black, clearly the devil, who asked her to sign a book. She spoke of yellow birds, red cats, spectral dogs. Most damning of all, she claimed there were other witches in Salem. That was all the authorities needed to hear. Once Tituba opened the door, others rushed through. New names surfaced weekly. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Old grudges were dressed up as holy duty. Property disputes became spectral attacks. A cow died suddenly. Witchcraft. A baby cried during prayer. The devil's work. Fear became contagious. To defend an accused person was to invite suspicion upon yourself. Silence became survival. And so the web of accusations widened, ensnaring the village in invisible, sticky threads. Logic faded. Hysteria took the reins. As panic peaked, the colonial government intervened. Governor William Phipps, newly appointed and eager to restore order, established a special tribunal, the Court of Oyer and Terminer French, for to hear and determine. But in practice, it became a factory for fear-driven justice, convening in Salem town in June 1692. The court abandoned normal legal safeguards. Instead of hard evidence or credible witnesses, it accepted something far more dangerous: spectral evidence. This meant testimony that the accused spirit or specter had tormented the victim. If someone claimed your ghostly form choked them in a dream, that counted as proof. It was your spirit doing the devil's bidding. You couldn't cross-examine a dream. You couldn't disprove a vision. Children became star witnesses. Their fits, screams, and gasps in court grew more dramatic by the day. Mary Walcott, for instance, would collapse the moment a suspected witch entered the room. If the accused looked at her, she shrieked. If they didn't, she shrieked louder. The performances captivated the courtroom and the judges, including influential figures like Samuel Sewall and Chief Justice William Stoughton, believed every word. There were no defense lawyers. The concept didn't exist in colonial trials. The accused stood alone. Deny the charges. The afflicted girls writhed in agony. Confess. You might be spared, but only if you named others. The system rewarded deception and punished silence. The trials became public spectacles. People traveled from neighboring towns to watch. The accused were marched into court in chains of iron, bewildered, often poor, always powerless. Yet not everyone was convinced. Some villagers whispered that the girls were faking. Others wondered why only certain people were targeted. But few spoke openly. To question the court was to question God's will. In Salem, reason had stepped aside, and the law had become a mirror of fear, not justice. On June 10, 1692, the gallows claimed its first victim, Bridget Bishop. She was no stranger to scandal. She wore bright red, ran a tavern, and had faced witchcraft accusations before. During her trial, neighbors testified that her spirit pinched them at night, that their babies died after she passed by, that she kept enchanted dolls. She denied everything. The court convicted her anyway. She was led to gallows hill, barren, wind-scoured patch of earth outside town. No final prayer, no mercy. The rope tightened. The crowd watched. With that execution, the machinery of death began to turn. Hangings followed swiftly. On July 19th, 5 more women died. Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Some were pillars of the church. Rebecca Nurse, in particular, shocked the community. Elderly and deeply pious, she was beloved by many. The jury initially acquitted Herb. Under pressure from the court and the afflicted girls, the verdict was overturned. Her final words drifted like a warning. I am as innocent as the child unborn. It didn't matter. The noose made no distinctions. In August, more executions occurred. On September 22nd, the deadliest day, 8 people were hanged in a single morning. Among them was Martha Corey, who had openly doubted the trials. Her husband, Giles Corey, met a different fate. He refused to enter a plea, and without one, the court couldn't proceed. So they resorted to an ancient English punishment, peine forte, each. Stones were piled onto his chest over 3 days. His last words, according to legend, more weight. By the end of the hysteria, 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death, and at least 5 more perished in jail, awaiting trial. Dozens falsely confessed to save their lives. Over 200 were accused. The gallows cast long shadows, not just on the hill, but in every heart. Fear had become law, and justice, blindfolded, had been led to the scaffold. While executions drew attention, hundreds languished in overcrowded, foul-smelling jails. Salem's prison overflowed. Accused witches were held in Ipswich and Boston, chained to walls, starving, freezing, forgotten. Most weren't outcasts. They were neighbors, parents, friends, people whose only crime was a quarrel with the wrong person or land someone else coveted. Grudges disguised as divine justice fueled the accusations. A pig wandered into a yard and died. Witchcraft. Someone refused firewood. They must have cursed the axe. Mary Easty, sister of the executed Rebecca Nurse, was a respected mother of 7, known for her piety. Initially released, she was rearrested after new fits from the afflicted girls. In a final petition, she didn't beg for her life. She was hanged soon after. Even children weren't spared. Dorothy Good, Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter was interrogated after her mother's arrest. Under pressure, she confessed in frightened gibberish. Taken as truth, she was imprisoned for 8 months in chains. When released, she was mentally shattered, never recovering. Pregnant women sometimes escaped death temporarily. Elizabeth Proctor, wife of John Proctor, who would later hang, was convicted and sentenced. But because she was pregnant, her execution was delayed, likely saving her life. She gave birth in jail and was freed after the trials ended. Accusations snowballed. Some confessed in desperation, then named others to deflect suspicion. Entire families were swept into the vortex. Fathers, mothers, daughters. Jails swelled beyond capacity. Disease spread. Some died in legal limbo, and still new names were added weekly. In Salem, it no longer mattered who you were, only who was willing to say your name. By fall 1692, the spell began to crack, not from wisdom, but from reality's intrusion. The turning point came when accusations grew reckless. People who once supported the trials suddenly found themselves targeted. Reverend George Burroughs, a former Salem minister, was arrested as the supposed ringleader of witches. Educated and articulate, he'd clashed with powerful families enough to seal his fate. But on the gallows, he did something astonishing. He recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly. Witches, it was believed, could not do this. The crowd fell silent. Some wept. Yet the execution proceeded. Still, doubt had taken root. Then came the accusation of Mary Phips, wife of Governor William Phips. Suddenly, hysteria reached the colony's highest ranks. Alarmed by mounting criticism and chaos, Phips dissolved the court of Owyre and Terminer in October 1692, halting all trials and pending executions. Public opinion shifted. Ministers who had stayed silent or worse, encouraged the frenzy, now spoke out. Reverend Increase Mather, one of the colony's most respected theologians, denounced spectral evidence. It were better, he declared, that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. A radical notion in a society that had spent months believing the opposite. Support for the trials waned. Too many respected figures were accused. Too many innocents were buried. Villagers began to see this wasn't divine justice, it was madness. Confessions dried up. Some accusers recanted. Others vanished from public view. Those who had screamed loudest now avoided eye contact. Fear hadn't vanished, but it had exhausted itself. The public craved stability. Officials sought to save face, and Salem, bruised and ashamed, was finally ready to wake from its nightmare. The storm was breaking, but the damage was already done by late 1692. The judicial system that fueled the hysteria collapsed under its own absurdity. In October, the court of Owyre and Terminer was disbanded. In early 1693, a new, more cautious body, the Superior Court of Judicature, took its place. This time, spectral evidence was banned, and judges grew skeptical of the girls' theatrics. Convictions slowed dramatically. Of the 56 cases heard, most resulted in acquittals or dismissals. Even those who had confessed began recanting, admitting fear, coercion, or torture had forced their lies. The afflicted girls' performances lost their power. A pivotal moment came when Reverend Samuel Willard, a prominent, devout minister, came under suspicion. Though never formally charged, The mere possibility that such a man could be accused revealed how arbitrary and corrupt the process had become. Once fierce, now moved quietly, releasing prisoners. First those with weak cases, then even those who had confessed under duress. Meanwhile, families of the executed demanded justice. John Proctor's children petitioned for the return of his property. Rebecca Nurse's family campaigned to clear her name. Shame, not fear, now defined the community. Church congregations fractured, friendships dissolved. Salem's social fabric lay in tatters. Governor Phipps, aware of the colony's growing international embarrassment, pardoned remaining prisoners in 1693, but freedom came at a price. Many had to pay jail fees before release. Imagine losing your home, your health, nearly your life, only to be billed for surviving. In the end, 19 were hanged, 1 pressed to death, 5 died in jail, and over 200 were accused. The court didn't just fail, it imploded, leaving behind a crater of grief, guilt, and disbelief. The trials had ended, but healing hadn't begun. Salem was forever altered by the lives it lost, the justice it abandoned, and the reflection it could no longer avoid. The gallows stood silent, the jails emptied, but peace didn't return. Salem wasn't haunted by ghosts, but by guilt. What began with a few sick girls exploded into collective destruction. Families shattered, reputations ruined, innocents executed. Survivors now lived in the wreckage. Neighbors avoided each other's gaze. The same people who once prayed together had testified against one another. Some afflicted girls left town quietly. Others faded away. A few, like in Putnam Jr., later expressed remorse. In 1706, she stood before her congregation and apologized, blaming delusion by Satan. But for many, words couldn't heal the wounds. Even court officials bore the weight. Judge Samuel Sewall was among the few to admit fault. In 1697, he stood in church as a minister, read his public confession and plea for forgiveness, a rare act of accountability in an age of denial. Forgetting proved impossible. Families of the condemned demanded restitution. Petitions poured into the Massachusetts government for pardons, property restoration, and official acknowledgement of innocence. Slowly, the colony responded. In 1711, it passed a bill restoring rights and names to some victims and offering limited financial compensation to heirs. But it wasn't comprehensive. Families like the Coreys and Proctors were excluded entirely. Whispers of witchcraft lingered in New England, but in Salem, shame became part of its identity. The village eventually renamed itself Danvers, perhaps to escape its past. Gallows Hill was never officially marked as if the town hoped to bury not just the dead, but the memory itself. Yet the memory endured in sermons, stories, and the silence between former friends. Salem hadn't been cursed by witches. It had been cursed by fear, pride, and unchecked power, and that curse outlasted the hangings. The Salem witch trials ended over 3 centuries ago, but their echo remains not just in textbooks and tours, but in how we understand justice, fear, and the fragility of truth. What happened in 1692 wasn't mere mass hysteria. It was a collapse of logic, compassion, and legal integrity under panic. Ordinary people, farmers, midwives, ministers, became executioners by believing too easily and questioning too little. Courts meant to protect the innocent became instruments of oppression. Religion was weaponized. Testimony turned to theater. Silence became guilt. One of the trial's most chilling truths is how quickly it unfolded. In months, fear overrode fact. Old grudges, dressed as spiritual warfare, became death sentences. No demons were needed, only belief in them. Yet the trials also yielded hard lessons that shaped American society. In later centuries, Salem was repeatedly cited in debates over due process and civil liberties. The U.S. Constitution, drafted nearly a century later, explicitly banned ex post facto laws and bills of attainder measures that had effectively doomed Salem's accused. The right to legal counsel, the right to confront accusers, the demand for tangible evidence, these principles were forged, in part, from the ashes of Gallows Hill. Today, witch hunt is often used casually to describe political persecution. But in Salem, it wasn't a metaphor. It was a town where people were hanged for imaginary crimes, betrayed by the very systems meant to shield them. Perhaps the deepest lesson is this: unchecked fear becomes tyranny. And when fear is legitimized by courts, churches, or governments, it becomes nearly unstoppable. The Salem witch trials are a cautionary tale, not just of one village's descent into madness, but of how easily reason falls when fear is given authority. The gallows may be gone, the courtrooms quiet, but the warning endures. Truth is fragile. Justice is not automatic, and history repeats itself unless we remember. Fulvia was born around 83 BCE into the distinguished, if slightly unconventional, Fulvia family, an old plebeian house that had clawed its way into Rome's ruling elite. Though not among the ancient patrician clans, the Fulvi had produced consuls, generals, and orators. Their lineage blended ambition with a flair for disruption. Her father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was remembered less for political prowess than for his clumsy speech. His nickname, Bambalio, literally meant stammerer, but Fulvia was no stammerer. She was born to command. From childhood, she moved through the sharp-edged world of Roman power. Senators and generals debated policy in her home. Elections, betrayals, and secret alliances were daily fare. She learned early that politics wasn't confined to the forum. It unfolded in marriages, funerals, rumors, and backroom pacts. Women in elite Roman households were expected to be silent partners, refined, educated, obedient. Fulvia shattered every expectation. She was wealthy, highly educated, and well-connected, and she knew it, though details of her youth remain scarce. Her later actions reveal a young woman who was keenly observant, deeply politically literate, and she was utterly unafraid. This wasn't someone who faded into the background. She possessed a commanding presence, a razor-sharp political intellect, and the resolve to act decisively in the mal-dominated arena of Roman governance. This was also a time of extraordinary upheaval. The Republic was disintegrating. Civil wars, populist uprisings, and fierce rivalries among generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar had turned Rome into a pressure cooker. The old order was crumbling, and Fulvia came of age right in the center of the storm. Rather than retreat from the chaos, she learned to harness it. Her youth did not produce the kind of modest, retiring matron Rome idealized. It forged a woman who saw politics not as a man's domain to be feared, but as a battlefield to be conquered. She would go on to marry three of the most powerful men in Roman history each, a radical force in his own right. But Fulvia didn't merely marry into power. She commanded armies, led revolts, and became the first Roman woman ever depicted on coinage not as a goddess, but as herself. Rome wasn't ready for Fulvia, but she was ready for Rome. Fulvia's first marriage was to Publius Clodius Pulcherand. It defied every convention. Clodius was no ordinary noble. He was a populist firebrand, a political provocateur with a genius for chaos, scandal, and street-level influence. To Rome's elite, he was dangerous. To the common people, he was a hero. And to Fulvia, he represented a strategic opportunity. Their union, formed in the early 50s BCE, linked her to the man who had turned the Roman Republic into his personal stage. Clodius was infamous for his brazen defiance of tradition. He once disguised himself as a woman to infiltrate a sacred women religious rite in Julius Caesar's Homan act of sacrilege that only amplified his popularity. He later renounced his patrician status to run for the tribunate of the plebs, an office that granted him veto power over the Senate. Clodius understood the pulse of Rome's urban politics better than almost anyone, and Fulvia, far from being a passive wife, stood firmly beside him. She wasn't a silent partner. Roman accounts suggest she actively engaged in his political world, meeting with supporters, appearing visibly during campaigns, and managing their household as a nerve center for Clodian operations. Together, they formed a new kind of Roman power, couple-bold, populist, and unapologetically combative. But the alliance came at a steep price. In 52 BCE, Clodius was murdered on the Appian Way by the bodyguards of his rival, Titus Annius Milo. His death sent shockwaves through the city, yet Fulvia refused to grieve quietly. She orchestrated a political funeral that historians still discuss today. She paraded Claudius's mutilated body through the Roman Forum, his wounds exposed to provoke outrage. The public was horrified and enraged. Riots erupted. The Senate House was burned to the ground. Fulvia had transformed personal sorrow into mass rebellion. This was her first major political maneuver, and it succeeded brilliantly. Her skill in manipulating public emotion, using spectacle as strategy, and weaponizing her husband's legacy established her as a formidable new player in Roman politics. Clodius was gone, but Fulvia had stepped into the light. Rome would never see her the same way again. She didn't linger in mourning. In Rome, political capital expired quickly, and she knew that better than most. Soon after Claudius's violent death, she entered a second marriage, this time to Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rising star and one of Julius Caesar's most fervent allies. On the surface, Curio seemed an odd match. He had a flamboyant reputation and a flair for drama. But beneath the theatrics was a shrewd political mind. As tribune of the plebs in 50 BCE, he wielded immense influence during one of Rome's most volatile periods. The Republic teetered between peace and civil war, caught between Caesar's ambitions, but a bridge to the next power block. This wasn't a romantic rebound, it was a calculated alliance. With Clodius gone, she needed a new anchor, someone who could carry forward the populist movement her first husband had built, and someone with Caesar's backing. Curio fit both roles perfectly. Through him, Fulvia remained deeply embedded in Rome's shifting power currents. She didn't just marry into the cause, she helped shape it. She ensured Claudius's supporters stayed active, rebranding their mission under Curio's leadership and keeping the urban masses politically energized. But the Roman world was collapsing fast. Tensions between Caesar and Pompey exploded into open civil war. Curio threw himself into the conflict, siding firmly with Caesar. Fulvia, as always, stayed politically engaged, reportedly helping organize, support, and manage resources for her husband's campaigns. In 49 BC, Curio led a military expedition to Africa to secure Caesar's interests, but it ended in catastrophe. He was ambushed and killed by the forces of King Juba of Numidia. His army was annihilated. Once again, Fulvia was widowed, and once again, Rome waited to see if she would vanish from public life. She didn't. Curio's death only cemented her reputation as a politically resilient widow. She had now lost 2 husbands to Rome's civil strife, both dying for populist causes. But Fulvia was far from finished. Her most audacious alliance and her most dramatic chapter still lay ahead. Fulvia's third and most famous marriage was to Mark Antony, the ambitious general and loyal lieutenant of Julius Caesar. Their union, formed around 47 BCE, was far more than a romantic bond. It was a merger of power by this point. Fulvia had already proven herself a master of Roman street politics. Antony, rapidly ascending in military and political rank, needed precisely that kind of savvy support in the capital. Together, they formed one of the most potent political couples of the late Republic. Fulvia was no stranger to bloodshed and betrayal. She had buried 2 husbands and outmaneuvered countless enemies. Antony, for his part, was no stranger to scandal. He drank heavily, gambled recklessly, and his personal life was notoriously turbulent. But with Fulvia, he found someone who could do more than entertain him. She could defend his interests, hold his fragile alliances together, and rally his base whenever he was away on campaign. And Antony, despite his bluster, recognized her value. He granted her an unprecedented degree of authority, more than any Roman woman had ever publicly exercised. She opened his correspondence, issued orders in his absence, sat in on meetings, and influenced key appointments. Roman historians, mostly hostile, depicted her as domineering and power-hungry. But what unsettled them most wasn't her ambition. It was that she behaved like a Roman man in a society that had no framework for such a woman. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, the Republic plunged once more into chaos. Antony raced to secure his position as Caesar's political heir, but it was Fulvia who held Rome itself. While Antony formed the second triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus, Fulvia acted as his representative in the capital, managing patronage networks, coordinating with street gangs, and ensuring his supporters remained mobilized. She even helped broker Antony's temporary reconciliation with Octavian by arranging the marriage of her daughter, Clodia, to him, an alliance that would later collapse spectacularly in public. Fulvia appeared not merely as Antony's wife, but as his proxy. Roman coins were minted bearing both Antony's image and her name, an unprecedented acknowledgement of her political stature. She wasn't lurking in the shadows of power. She stood fully illuminated in its glare. But power in Rome was always borrowed on. Fulvia was about to test how far a woman could push before the Republic pushed back. While Mark Antony waged campaigns and negotiated deals across the Mediterranean. It was Fulvia who controlled the streets of Rome. She wasn't just his spouse. In an era where order was maintained through violence, bribery, and raw influence, Fulvia proved she could play the game as skillfully, if not more so than any senator. Rome after Caesar's murder was a battlefield without swords. Power shifted like sand. Fulvia understood this, and she anchored Antony's authority in the capital by becoming his political surrogate. She directed allies, negotiated with urban factions, and engaged directly with the plebeian masses. Most daringly, she waged war, not with steel, but with silver and speech. She financed loyal troops, distributed bribes to maintain public order, and ensured that legislation favored Antony's future ambitions. Ancient sources, especially hostile ones like Appian and Cassius Dio, portray her as manipulative, shrewish, even warmongering. But beneath the misogynistic caricature was a woman actively practicing politics in a world that offered women no formal role beyond weaving and mourning. Fulvia was building coalitions, backing military commanders, and even issuing decrees, functions normally reserved for consuls and senators. She made public appearances and maintained strong ties with veteran soldiers, a crucial demographic in the late Republic's power struggles. While Antony campaigned in the East, Fulvia often served as the face of his authority in Italy, meeting with centurions, shaping decisions about land distribution, and reminding soldiers that loyalty to Antony came with tangible rewards. Yet this accumulation of influence came at a cost. Roman aristocrats, particularly those aligned with Octavian, Caesar's heir, and Antony's increasingly bitter rival, deeply resented Fulvia's sway. They saw her as a meddlesome woman wielding undue control over legions, laws, and loyalties. Her ability to act independently without a male guardian wasn't just threatening, it was unprecedented. She recognized the growing rift between Antony and Octavian. She saw their alliance fraying and understood something neither man had yet fully grasped. The Republic wasn't large enough for both of them, so she began preparing for the next phase. Not diplomacy, but confrontation. She had stood behind power long enough. Now she was ready to seize it herself. In 41 BCE, Fulvia did the unthinkable. She went to war against Octavian, the future Augustus. And she didn't do it quietly. With Mark Antony still stationed in the East, Fulvia and Lucius Antonius, Antony's younger brother and a sitting consul, launched a direct challenge to Octavian's authority in Italy, the official cause. To defend Antony's interests and protect land rights for veterans loyal to him. But beneath the surface, Fulvia's hand was everywhere. This wasn't just politics, it was open military rebellion led by a Roman woman, the first and only time in Roman history that a woman would actively provoke and organize a civil war. The conflict, known as the Puricini War, erupted over Octavian's controversial land redistribution program, which displaced thousands of Italians to reward his own soldiers. Fulvia seized on the widespread anger, framing Octavian as a tyrant betraying Caesar's legacy. With Lucius as her public face in the Senate, and Fulvia orchestrating behind the scenes, they raised 8 legions and seized the city of Perusia, modern Perusia. Make no mistake, this was Fulvia's war. Ancient sources suggest she was more committed to the conflict than Lucius himself. She rallied troops, stirred public outrage, and corresponded directly with generals. Rumors spread through Rome that she was commanding legions, issuing orders, and pushing Lucius into confrontations he didn't want. Octavian, though surprised, responded swiftly. He besieged Perugia through the winter of 41 to 40 BCE, cutting off supplies and grinding the city into submission. Fulvia, caught between dwindling food and political betrayal, watched her bold gamble collapse. By early 40 BCE, the city surrendered. Lucius Antonius was spared, likely to avoid alienating Antony, but Fulvia was exiled. The woman who had once commanded riots, marriages, armies, and public opinion was now deemed too dangerous for Roman soil. She was sent to Sicyon in Greece, where she hoped to reunite with Antony, but Antony didn't rush to her side. Their once powerful partnership had eroded in the fog of war and distance. Fulvia had acted in his name, but perhaps without his approval. She had dared to do what no Roman woman had ever done: wage civil war. And now the Republic had exacted its price, banished from Rome. Fulvia arrived in Sicyon, a city that had become a kind of diplomatic purgatory for fallen power players. She had gone to war not for personal gain, but to defend Mark Antony's interests, his honor, and their shared vision for Rome. Yet what awaited her in exile wasn't a hero's welcome. It was silence. She had risked everything: her status, her alliances, her life. And Antony did not immediately come to her aid. In fact, by the time she reached Greece, he was already entangled with Cleopatra in Egypt. Whether their romantic relationship had fully begun or was still forming, the symbolism was devastating. While Fulvia raised legions, Antony raised goblets at banquets beside a queen. The betrayal cut deep, not just personally, but politically. Fulvia had fought to secure Antony's power in Italy, and, in return, he let her be cast aside. Antony was furious that she launched the Purusini War without his direct consent. Others argue he welcomed her downfall. It cleared the path for a marriage alliance with Octavian, something Fulvia would never have allowed. Still, she wasn't entirely abandoned. Some of Antony's troops, fiercely loyal to her, urged reconciliation. But her health was failing. After enduring siege, exile, and betrayal, Fulvia died in Sicyon in 40 BCE, likely from illness, stress, heartbreak, or some combination of all three. She was around 43 years old. Her death gave Antony a clean political exit. He soon met with Octavian and agreed to marry his sister, Octavia, as part of a renewed peace treaty. The triumvirate was temporarily restored, but only because Fulvia, the one woman bold enough to challenge their designs, was gone. Fulvia's legacy would soon be overshadowed by Cleopatra, whose legend eclipsed nearly every Roman woman of the era. But make no mistake, Fulvia was the prototype. She didn't wield influence from behind a curtain. She marched into the center of power and dared to command armies in a world that treated women as decorative objects. Rome didn't know what to do with her, so it tried to erase her. But the embers of her rebellion lingered. Her story was far from ordinary. After Fulvia's death, in 40 BCE, the men she had once maneuvered, Donony, Octavian, even former allies, began quietly rewriting her legacy. She couldn't defend herself, so the narrative was shaped by enemies and uneasy survivors of her ambition. Like so many powerful women in history, she became a scapegoat. Ancient sources, almost all written by men with vested interests, blamed her for the Prussian War, the rift between Antony and Octavian, and even the broader instability of the Republic. Appian, Cassius, Dio, and Plutarch painted her as overbearing, jealous, and consumed by lust for power. They accused her of dragging Lucius into conflict, provoking Octavian, and even causing Antony's eventual alienation from Rome. But were these charges fair? Hardly. Fulvia operated in a political climate where violence and manipulation were not only accepted but expected of men. She was no more ambitious than Caesar, no more aggressive than Pompey, and far less ruthless than Octavian would later prove to be. Her only true transgression was that she was a woman acting like a Roman manon, weaving in silence or serving as a political ornament. She wrote letters to generals, organized street mobs, and commanded the loyalty of troops. That made her dangerous not just to Octavian, but to history itself. Even Mark Antony, the man whose legacy she had fought to protect, conveniently blamed Fulvia for the civil strife. After reconciling with Octavian and marrying his sister, Antony used her death as diplomatic cover. Her memory became the price of his political survival. There were no monuments in her honor, no grand funeral, no eulogies in the Senegist silence. Yet her enemies couldn't erase her entirely. Fulvia had done too much. She had raised armies, steered elections, negotiated alliances, and fought a civil war. She was the first Roman woman whose name appeared on coinage not as a symbol, but as a political actor. The damage to her reputation was deliberate, but so was her presence in the historical record. Despite every attempt to bury her beneath slander and caricature, Fulvia refused to vanish. Her defiance still echoes. You just have to listen past the men. Fulvia's story ends in silence, but her legacy is anything but quiet. In the centuries after her death, historians struggled to fit her into their Rome's grand narrative because she shattered every expectation of what a Roman woman should be. She didn't merely advise power from the shadows, she became power. And that made her both unforgettable and deeply unsettling to a patriarchal world. In a society where women were supposed to influence through whispers and marriage, Fulvia shouted through policy, war, and political theater. She wasn't a consort. She was a commander. And yet, she was remembered more for her defiance than her achievements. Roman historians couldn't handle a woman who refused to stay in her place, so they recast her as shrill, power-hungry, and disruptive. But read between the lines, and a different portrait emerges. Fulvia was the first Roman woman to mint coins with her name. She organized political factions, used marriage as a tactical weapon, and manipulated Rome's urban politics with stunning effectiveness. She moved through the civil wars of the 1st century BCE, not as a bystander, but as a key player, woman whose influence terrified senators and shaped the fate of triumvirs. Her downfall wasn't due to incompetence. It was due to timing and gender. Had she been born a man, she might have been hailed as a second Caesar or a more charismatic Cato. Instead, she was branded the wicked woman who dared too much. Still, her legacy quietly endured. Later, Roman women, Livia, Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and even Cleopatra, though from a different realm, would all operate in the space Fulvia helped carve. They would manipulate emperors, wield armies, and control succession. But Fulvia did it firsthand, without an imperial title to shield her. Today, modern historians are re-examining Fulvia with fresh eyes. No longer a cautionary tale, she is now recognized as one of the most politically active women in Roman history, a pioneer who tested the limits of female power and paid the ultimate price. She didn't just live in the age of triumvirs, she challenged them. And while Rome may have tried to erase her, Fulvia left fingerprints in every corner of its collapse. Not a footnote of force. A woman centuries ahead of her time. By the summer of 1963, the United States stood at a crossroads, caught between a past rooted in centuries of oppression and a future yearning for freedom. In the Deep South, segregation wasn't merely custom, it was the law. Black Americans were barred from restaurants, schools, buses, voting booths, and even drinking fountains. Police brutality was rampant. Lynchings still occurred. And in places like Birmingham, Alabama, peaceful demonstrators were met with snarling police dogs and hypersure fire hoses. But change was coming, and it wasn't asking for permission. In just a few years, the civil rights movement had surged into the national consciousness. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and boycotts had become familiar headlines. Leaders like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and John Lewis were no longer just individuals, they were symbols of resistance. The March on Washington wasn't born from a single conversation. It emerged from rising frustration and unwavering hope. Black Americans were no longer willing to wait. They demanded civil rights and they were determined to make their voices heard. Where it mattered most, the nation's capital. The idea of a mass march in Washington, D.C. had circulated for decades. Philip Randolph, a labor organizer and longtime civil rights advocate, had first proposed it in the 1940s to pressure President Roosevelt into desegregating the defense industry. That protest was called off after Roosevelt relented and signed an executive order. But by 1963, the stakes were higher. Randolph, alongside other civil rights leaders, including Bayard Rustin and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., revived the vision. This time, they weren't marching only for jobs. They were marching for dignity, voting rights, school integration, equal pay, and, most fundamentally, the right to live without fear. Over a dozen major civil rights organizations came together to plan the event, despite their many disagreements, because they understood the power of a united front. The countdown had begun. Buses were being chartered. Flyers were circulating. Word of mouth spread faster than newspapers. Across the country, Black Americans were preparing for what would become one of the most unforgettable moments in American history. The dream was taking shape one step at a time. Organizing any protest in Washington, D.C. was a formidable task, but planning one for over 100,000 people, possibly more, seemed impossible. Logistically, it was a nightmare. Food, water, transportation, sound systems, restrooms, medical teams, permits, crowd control, safety protocols. And yet, somehow, they made it happen. At the heart of this controlled chaos stood Bayard Rustin, a man who, despite being openly gay and often kept out of the spotlight for political reasons, was a master strategist. Rustin had studied nonviolence firsthand with followers of Mahatma Gandhi in India. He had marched, been jailed, beaten, and surveilled by the FBI, but nothing deterred him. He saw the March on Washington as a chance to show the world what disciplined, nonviolent protest could achieve when executed with military precision. In just 8 weeks, Rustin and his team transformed the vision into reality. The event was officially titled the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and it was deliberately framed to link racial justice with economic opportunity. That dual message was no accident. While Dr. King would later become the spiritual face of the day, it was Randolph and Rustin who ensured the demands included unemployment, minimum wage, and workers' rights as much as civil liberties. Meanwhile, tensions simmered beneath the surface. President John F. Kennedy and his administration were deeply uneasy. They feared riots, backlash, or worse, bloodshed. Civil rights leaders assured them the protest would be peaceful. Still, the National Guard was placed on standby. Hospitals in D.C. prepared for emergencies. Liquor sales were banned for the day. Federal workers were even given the option to stay home. And then there was the question of unity. The Big Six civil rights organizations, the NAACP, CORE, SNCC, SCLC, the National Urban League, and Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car, Porter Soften, clashed over tactics. Some wanted more radical action. Others favored diplomacy. SNCC's young activists were growing impatient with King's strict nonviolence. But they all agreed on one thing: the time for silence had passed. Rustin's plan read like a military campaign. Every bus and train was tracked. Every speaker was timed to the minute. Every route had trained marshals for crowd control. They weren't just planning a march, they were orchestrating a moment that would shake the conscience of a nation. August 28, 1963. A sweltering Wednesday in Washington, D.C. The sun was already oppressive by 9 a.m., and the humidity clung to the skin like a second layer of clothing. But it didn't stop them. From every corner of the country, they came, black and white, young and old, students, clergy, factory workers, and celebrities. Some wore their Sunday best. Others carried handmade signs. They arrived by bus, train, carpool, and even on foot. Over 250,000 people in total converged on the National Mall like a rising tide of hope. And yet there was no chaos. Despite the government's fears of riots and unrest, the scene was astonishingly calm. Volunteers directed foot traffic. The Red Cross handed out water. Groups sang freedom songs, held hands, and cheered as new marchers arrived. Gospel choirs filled the air near the reflecting pool. Chants of jobs and freedom echoed off the marble columns of the Lincoln Memorial. Celebrities joined to Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, but no one was there for autographs. They were there to witness history and lend their voices to a cause greater than any individual. The crowd was orderly but alive with purpose, energized. There was no shoving, no looting, no violence. Instead, there was a shared understanding that this wasn't merely a protest, it was a sacred moment. For many Black Americans, simply standing on the mall felt like a quiet act of revolution, to be seen, to be counted, to declare we are here before the very Lincoln Memorial where the great emancipator sat in stone. It was a full-circle moment, generations in the making. At precisely noon, the official program began. Leaders took the stage, one by one, each representing different organizations, philosophies, and regions, but united in message. They demanded equal pay, integrated schools, a living wage, and an end to police brutality. Mahalia Jackson sang, Marian Anderson, who had once been barred from performing at Constitution Hall because of her race, now sang for thousands beneath the open sky. As the hours passed, the tension grew not from unrest, but from anticipation. The man everyone had come to hear had not yet spoken, and when he did, the world would stop, listen, and remember. The march wasn't just making history. It was becoming legend. Minute by mid-afternoon, the crowd had fallen quiet, not from exhaustion, but because they knew what was coming. Standing in the shade of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. approached the podium. He wore a dark suit, a neatly knotted tie, and an expression of calm that barely masked the fire within. He carried prepared remarks, typed and refined with his advisors the night before. But what the world would remember wasn't what was written on paper. It was what rose from his soul. He began with deliberate force, laying bare the harsh truths of segregation, police violence, and broken promises. 100 years later, he said, referencing the Emancipation Proclamation, the Negro is still not free. His voice swelled and softened like a sermon. He wielded repetition, rhythm, and silence not as pauses, but as instruments of power. The crowd listened in rapt attentions, some nodding, some weeping, others holding signs that simply read now. But what happened next shifted the entire tone of the event, and perhaps the course of the civil rights movement itself. Standing just behind King was gospel legend Mahalia Jackson, who had sung earlier that day. Suddenly, she called out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." And King did. He set aside his notes, gripped the podium, and launched into a passage he'd spoken before, but never like this. "I have a dream," he said, and the crowd leaned in. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed." Each phrase grew louder, clearer, more resolute. "I have a dream that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." It wasn't a speech anymore. It was a vision, a prayer, a lightning bolt through history. By the time King closed with the words, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last," the crowd erupted in applause, tears, and cries of joy. They knew they had witnessed more than oratory. They had heard prophecy. The true power of the March on Washington wasn't only in the speeches or the music. It was in the people. The sheer scale of humanity gathered that day was overwhelming. They came from Mississippi, Michigan, Alabama, New York, California, and everywhere in between. Some were seasoned activists who had marched a dozen times before. Others had never left their hometowns until that day. They packed lunches, rode buses for over 20 hours, and slept in their church clothes just to be present. Many were ordinary people-maids, teachers, steelworkers, postal clerks who saw themselves not as political figures, but as witnesses. They didn't just want change. They were the change. There were also children in the crowd, young black girls with ribbons in their hair, boys with hand-drawn signs. Parents lifted toddlers onto their shoulders so they could glimpse the Lincoln Memorial in the distance and hear the voices carried over loudspeakers. To them, this wasn't just an event. It was the dawn of a new world. Some faces stood out. There was a young John Lewis, only 23, representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. His original speech had been so fiery, so uncompromising, that senior leaders asked him to soften it minutes before he took the stage. He agreed, but barely. His call for radical transformation still shook the crowd, and then there was Daisy Bates, the only woman to speak that day, not on her own behalf, but reading a prepared statement for other civil rights women. Organizers had faced criticism for marginalizing female voices. Bates's brief but potent message underscored a painful truth. Even within a movement for equality, some voices still struggled to be heard. Also present were union organizers, rabbis, nuns, priests, and students of every background. They didn't all agree on strategy. Some embraced King's nonviolence. Others leaned toward Malcolm X's more militant stance. But for that one day, those differences didn't matter. Unity prevailed. It was a visual symphony of American possibility, black and white hands clasped in solidarity. Freedom now buttons pinned to chests, and the sound of 250,000 souls breathing as one. The faces in the crowd weren't just watching history unfold. They were shaping it, and none of them would ever forget what they saw. While the world saw unity, inspiration, and poetic justice on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, behind the scenes, the March on Washington was anything but seamless. What appeared as a perfectly synchronized movement was, in truth, held together by thread, sweat, and last-minute compromises by our Rustin. The march's chief architect battled not only logistics but politics. He was under constant scrutiny, not just because he was openly gay and a former communist, but because some civil rights leaders feared his identity would be weaponized to discredit the entire effort. In fact, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell had once threatened to publicly accuse Rustin and Dr. King of being lovers if King didn't remove Rustin from an earlier campaign. That threat shadowed every phase of planning. Then there was the issue of women's voices. Despite the indispensable roles of women like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height, none were invited to deliver major speeches on their own. Rosa Parks was in the crowd that day, honored by Albert. She was not given the microphone. Behind the powerful imagery of the march lay this truth. The movement still grappled with its own hierarchies and blind spots. Even among the Big Six organizations, tensions simmered. SNCC leaders were growing disillusioned with the slow pace of change and the older generation's insistence on moderation. They wanted to confront systemic racism more directly. CORE shared similar frustrations, but unity was deemed too vital, even if only for one day. Meanwhile, the federal government watched with clenched teeth. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI assigned over 100 agents to monitor organizers. They bugged hotel rooms, trailed key figures, and compiled dossiers, convinced the march would turn violent or be hijacked by communists. They doubled down on surveillance, especially of Dr. King. When the day passed peacefully. And let's not forget the cost. The march totaled over $250,000, equivalent to millions today. Most was raised through unions and sympathetic donors, but organizers scrambled until the final hour. They even borrowed walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts. The March on Washington was historic. Yes, but it was also deeply human. imperfect, messy, political, and unfinished. Just like the nation, it sought to heal. As the sun dipped behind the Washington Monument, the crowds slowly dispersed. People hugged, wept, sang, and lingered as long as they could, reluctant to leave what felt like sacred ground. But the march was over. The speeches had been delivered. The signs had been raised. The world had watched, and now a question hung heavy in the humid August air. What happens next? In the days that followed, media coverage was cautiously positive. Major newspapers acknowledged the event's historic significance, though often with detached curiosity. Many described it as orderly and dignified, code for no one rioted. Few gave space to the march's concrete demands. Like a federal jobs program or a $2 minimum wage equivalent to about $20 today. But everyone covered Dr. King's speech. That, at least, could not be ignored. President John F. Kennedy, who had initially opposed the march, watched it unfold on television with growing admiration and, perhaps, surprise. He called it impressive and met with civil rights leaders at the White House shortly after. Yet, legislative progress remained sluggish. His proposed Civil Rights Act remained stalled in Congress, blocked by Southern opposition. Some activists were disappointed. They had hoped the march would trigger immediate action. Instead, it was back to the grind, organizing, marching, resisting and mourning those who paid the ultimate price for justice. Just weeks later, that reality struck with brutal force. On September 15, 1963, 4 black girls were killed in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. The dream had been voiced, yes, but the nightmare wasn't over. Still, something had shifted. The March on Washington marked a new phase in the civil rights movement. It proved that mass protest could be disciplined, powerful, and impossible to ignore. It forged a broader coalition than ever before labor unions, faith leaders, celebrities, students, and working-class Americans all in one place, united by justice. Most of all, it gave the movement a voice, a dream, a speech that would be quoted, studied, and echoed across the globe. The march was over, but the road had just begun, and that road would soon wind through blood, legislation, and transformation. The March on Washington didn't just stir America's conscience. It reshaped its moral landscape. What began as an audacious act of protest became a cornerstone of the civil rights legacy, permanently altering how Americans understand justice, democracy, and the power of collective action. Legislatively, the march yielded no immediate wins, but it generated unstoppable momentum. Less than a year later, in July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. It outlawed segregation in public spaces and banned employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act followed, striking at the core of Jim Crow. Would these bills have passed without the march? Possibly, but would they have carried the same moral authority, the same undeniable public pressure? Unlikely. For Martin Luther King Jr., that day's speech catapulted him into a new realm. He moved from respected leader to global icon. But fame came at a cost: intensified surveillance, death threats, and ultimately, assassination in 1968. The dream he articulated on those steps grew more poignant, more tragic, and more revered with each passing year. For the broader movement, The march demonstrated what unity could achieve. It provided a blueprint for large-scale mobilization and inspired generations of activists both in the U.S. and abroad. Anti-apartheid organizers in South Africa, student protesters in Europe, and human rights leaders worldwide would later cite the March on Washington as a model. But the legacy isn't just historical. The language of the march, the call for jobs and freedom, the image of peaceful resistance, the echoes of "I have a dream" still pulses through modern protests. From the Million Man March to Black Lives Matter rallies, the spirit of 1963 reverberates in every chant and every cardboard sign held aloft in Washington. D.C. King's Memorial now stands across the tidal basin from the Lincoln Memorial. Visitors walk past his towering stone likeness with words from that August day etched into granite. But the true memorial isn't in stone. It's in classrooms, voting booths, marches, and voices that refuse to stay silent because the dream was never meant to rest in history books. It was meant to be lived, and the legacy of that summer afternoon still dares us to do just that. More than 60 years have passed since that August day when over 250,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. The March on Washington has been immortalized in textbooks, documentaries, and museum exhibits. Dr. King's speech is taught in schools. His voice, steady, soaring, prophetic, echoes in the national memory like a sacred refrain. But for many, a question endures. Has the dream been realized or merely delayed? In some ways, progress is undeniable. The legal architecture of segregation was dismantled. Voting rights, though now under renewed assault in many states, were won through sacrifice, marches, and court battles. The presence of black lawmakers, judges, mayors, and even a two-term U.S. president would have been unimaginable in 1963. Interracial marriage, once illegal across much of the country, is now federally protected. These are not minor achievements. They are victories forged through relentless struggle. And yet, the march's original demands, those often eclipsed by King's speech, still echo unresolved. The call for a living wage remains unmet. Racial disparities in education, housing, employment, and healthcare persist. Police brutality, the very injustice that fueled early civil rights organizing, continues to spark outrage and protest. Dream of true economic justice. A nation. Opportunity isn't dictated by zip code or skin color is still far from reality. Modern movements like Black Lives Matter have taken up the mantle, often invoking the imagery and rhetoric of the 1963 march as both inspiration and indictment. They march through the same cities, chant on the same streets, and demand the same fundamental human rights, but in a world reshaped by social media, mass surveillance, and new forms of resistance. The March on Washington was never meant to be the finale. It was a flashpoint, a stake in the ground, declaring, "This is who we are, and this is what we demand." It was a declaration, not a resolution. So the dream remains battered, challenged, reinterpreted, but still alive. Whether it is deferred, distorted, or one day fulfilled depends not on the past, but on us, on the choices we make, the injustices we confront, and the courage we summon to march again and again till the dream becomes a shared, lived reality.